Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for your lunch hour. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to join us and we'll probably get started about 12:05. In the meantime, grab yourself a coffee and buckle up for some in-depth conversation. Sound a bit like a broken record, but for those of you who are newly joined, we're just giving folks a couple more minutes to trickle in and then we'll get started here in about 2 minutes. All right, folks. We have a lot to get through, and so we'll continue to let people trickle in as we go along. But for the sake of time, and we need to get through as much as possible, we're going to get started. Thank you again for joining us over your lunch hour to go through Bill 54, the Election Statutes Amendment Act. I'm Aileen Burke. I'm the director for the nonprofit and voluntary sector here at Alberta Council, and I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
And my name is Moin Yahya. I'm a lawyer here at Alberta Council on the legal side.
So there's a lot to get through for this webinar. I want to caveat right off the hop. There's a lot of moving pieces in this legislation. It impacts 11 different acts. Cross-references a lot of things. This is not to be taken as gospel. This is not legal advice. This is simply a high-level overview of the legislation. Noting that it hasn't passed yet, amendments could be made, regulations will still come, et cetera, et cetera. So we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible as they come through, but know that we might not have all the answers and that some of your questions might require you going back to legal counsel on your own to get more specific details. So just right off the hop, wanted to make sure that we were clear on that. Moyne, anything to add?
Yeah, and two things also. As Eileen said, you know, if you have a specific, I mean, we'll try to answer questions today, and if we can't, or we apologize. This is a very big bill, and we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to keep the overview high level. And it may be that you have a very specific question. So in that case, we may follow up we may take some of those questions and try to answer them a little bit. Maybe we'll ponder them and then try to maybe do a written follow-up later. If you have a particular situation that you're actually contemplating, then obviously consult counsel, whether you have one or if you know, we do have legal representation here in Alberta Council if that's something you're interested in. But if not, you have your own lawyer, do that too. And the other caveat I would say is, given that these a lot of acts are being amended, and there are agencies, for example, Elections Alberta, that are in charge of enforcing a lot of these, their information on their website may not be up to date, obviously, right now, because it's still following the old act. These are amendments that have not been passed. So if you are going to try to rely on something that one of the agencies or government bodies is, double check that they have actually updated their site, and in light of Bill 54 when it is passed, make sure that you get that clarification from them that what's on their website is actually the latest, or once the bill passes, that has been updated to reflect the amendments.
Okay, so with that all said and done, we're gonna power through this. This is kind of the table of contents of what we're gonna go through. I'm going to say my general preference is not to read off the slides, because I know that you all know how to read, but this is such a complicated, in-depth thing that I'm going to be doing a lot of reading from the slides, so I apologize, but I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. So with that, we'll just get going. So Bill 54 was introduced on April 29th. It's a 290-page omnibus bill that proposes more than 50 changes to rules around elections and amends 11 different acts. It refreshes almost every law that governs how Albertans register, campaign, vote, launch petitions, hold referenda, and recalls, and finance politics.
And it purports to so it's as complicated as it is. The older mishmash of laws, Election Act, Election Finances and Contribution Disclosure Act, et cetera, these acts sometimes had inconsistencies within them and sometimes inconsistencies across them. And so one of the goals of this is to actually try to harmonize definitions and concepts across, not only within each bill, but also across the bills.
Fine. So we'll start with the Alberta Senate Election Act. These are kind of the three key changes that have happened. CEO is now given the power to recommend suspension of a Senate election as required. Recommendations for discontinuation and commencement at a different time for these elections can only happen if the election is being held in conjunction with a general election, and if the CEO is of the opinion that an extension or adjournment is insufficient to address concerns. It also gives them the power to discontinue and commence an election due to an emergency. Adds the requirement for the CEO to consult with the band council of each Indian band and with the Métis Settlement Council and Settlement Administrator of each Métis settlement to determine the availability and suitability of a voting place. If band or settlement council agrees to the use of the building, the CEO must use that building as a voting place. And then it shifts the power to conduct a Senate election when held in conjunction with municipal election from the minister to the CEO. Other minor changes include the addition of definitions for CEO and local jurisdiction.
Nothing to add other than to correct myself. In the previous slide, I said consistency across bills. I meant consistency across acts, because these are acts that are already passed.
Citizen Initiative Act. So this aligns the three types of citizen initiatives: policy, legislative, and constitutional. All three initiative types now have the same signature threshold. One of the changes proposed in this bill is that it will lower the signature threshold and extend the signature gathering windows. So now these initiatives will require 10% of the number of eligible voters who voted in the last general election, which is a change from the 20% of registered voters. And for general, for the policy and legislative initiatives, and for constitutional ones, it removes the 2/3 of constituencies requirements as well. And then the signature window is now extended from 90 days to 120 days. It establishes vote timelines and successful initiative petitions. It adds the requirement that a referendum be held on or before the date fixed for the next general election, or in the case when the next general election is less than 12 months away, the referendum must be scheduled before the following next election. Opens contributions to corporations and trade unions, it was individual only, and then lets the CEO impose administrative penalties, integrates Election Act and EFDA enforcement tools. So this is to Moy's point about consistency and trying to align acts. This is bringing in Election Act and EFCDA enforcement tools here. Moy, are you looking? Are you? Okay.
Keep going. Yeah, no.
For 0.5, judicial review and admin penalty frameworks are imported from the Election Act as well. So there's I think I got the timelines wrong. Anyway, add or changes timelines for the CEO regarding application requirements have been met, notice that a proposal for a petition has been forwarded to the court, issuance of the petition, and the verification of signature requirements. So there's now a 30-day requirement to ensure that application requirements have been met to issue a petition. And then within 60 days, if that matter is being referred to court, there's a 7-day notice now period, rather down from 14 days that a matter has been forwarded to the court. Within 7 days after the notice of initiative petition is posted on the CEO's website, which is a decrease from 30 days. And then the timelines have reduced from 60 days to 21 days to verify whether signature requirements were met and whether the initiative then was successful.
So a couple of key, I think the main points, and you've probably read about this in the press, that come out of this. There's a lot of changes to the Citizen Initiative Act, but probably the ones that a lot of people are focused on. It used to be that the threshold for getting a citizens initiative going was either 10% of registered voters for just a policy or legislative kind of change, and 20% of registered voters if you wanted a constitutional type initiative, and that you had to also get that in 2/3 of all the electoral divisions. So in other words, there was a kind of a double requirement for constitutional. It was 20% instead of 10% of all voters, and then you had to do this in at least 2/3 of all the electoral districts. That has now been harmonized for 10% of voters who voted in the last election. And that's regardless of whether it's policy, legislation, or constitutional. And there's no requirement of 2/3 of the electoral districts anymore for the constitutional type changes. So just practically what that means is there are probably 3 million plus eligible registered voters. If you wanted to do a citizens initiative on a constitutional matter, and the elephant in the room, secession, right? It would have been 20% of that, so about 600,000, 500,000 to 600,000. Now you only need 10% of those who voted in the last election, which is about 1.8 or 1.7 million. So you need about between 170 and 180,000. I don't have the exact number, but something around there. So that's the big change. There's also this provision about the court. So what Eileen was talking about is that now the chief electoral officer, if they're not sure if this constitutional question is the kind of question that is within provincial jurisdiction, if you put an initiative to amend the criminal code, for example, that's federal jurisdiction. So even if you got all the votes and you took it to the chief electoral officer, they have the option to ask the Court of Appeal that, is this actually within Alberta's jurisdiction? So that's what the discussion was about, the reference to the court.
The next act is the Election Act. Key changes here, obviously, we've all seen advance the use of voting machines, tabulators, or other similar types of electronic equipment to be used for the counting of votes. Changes to voter eligibility include it removes the no ID vouching options, removes the ability of voters in a provincial election to vote outside of their constituency designated station, so this is the vote anywhere clause. And expands the use of special ballots where voters can use one without having to give a specific reason. It adds voting location and advanced voting provision criteria. So to this point, voting locations must now meet two criteria on election day. At least 95% of the electors' ordinary residences in the voting area are within 50 kilometers of a voting place. And in each population center with at least 1,000 residents, there has to be at least one voting place on voting day. For advanced voting, every population center with more than 1,000 people must get at least one advanced poll, and polls must run from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. For centers with a population between 1,000 and 2,500 people, advanced vote must be open at least one of the days between Tuesday and Sunday, the week before election day. And then for population centers with more than 2,500 people, at least one center must be available on each of the days of Tuesday through Sunday. It expands the use of special ballots. Special ballots, as I said, may now be issued without the voter first giving a reason, which allows a voter to cast a ballot. It also allows a voter to cast a ballot by indicating the party leader's name rather than their local candidate, and now requires that voters request a special ballot themselves and that the signature on the special ballot match the signature on the voter's ID. And then it guarantees municipal councillors and school trustees an unpaid leave from the writ to election day when running provincially. More changes to the act. So fine ceilings have at least doubled. Municipalities have lost the jurisdiction over election advertising signs. They are prohibited from passing a bylaw or resolution respecting election signs or election advertisements. We have had questions about whether or not this applies to municipal elections. Our best guess right now, and it's a guess because it's not explicitly stated in the act, is yes, this will apply to your municipal elections, but we are not 100% sure on that answer. It repeals the entire no election advertising at voting place section. It changes a bunch of timelines. So advanced vote and special ballot counts can now start no more than 3 hours before the close of all voting places in an electoral division. Unofficial counts must now be finished within 12 hours of polls closing. Election documents must now be retained for 6 months instead of 3. The inspection of election documents period is extended from 30 days to 90 days. And the administrative penalty period is reduced from 3 years to 1 year. Political parties are now added to the list of those allowed to inspect election documents and request judicial recounts. Currently, only candidates and their official representatives have this authority. And then it adds Lieutenant Governor regulatory allowance respecting procedures and documents required to demonstrate an elector's Canadian citizenship. Other changes that are less notable, but still important to know, it just adds a bunch of definitions to the act itself. And then it adds section 4.21, which is advice and recommendations, which provides the power for the CEO to give written advisory opinions.
Two interesting changes here. One is the political parties are now eligible to be part of the groups. It used to be that only the candidate could go in and double check check the ballots or contest them, and whether it was a scrutineering or just having access to ballots. I suppose the idea is that if a candidate doesn't want to contest it, but the party does, then this way the party has a way to ensure for itself that the integrity of the election process, as opposed to just relying on the candidate to do so. So that's one change. The other interesting change, it's a really minor one, but it's interesting. It's it prevents a single official agent from acting on behalf of more than one independent candidate. I suppose this is to avoid the 90-person ballot that we've seen in the federal elections. So if you're trying to put a lot of independents, you need a different agent for each one. So you can't have one guy registering 90 candidates. So I suspect that's probably what was behind that. I don't know for sure, but that seems to be the implication of that.
Election Finances and Contributions Disclosure Act. It's a lot in this one, but key changes: reintroduces corporate union donations, which we've already kind of spoke about. Creates this new entity called Prospective Candidate Associations, PCAs, with full registration, reporting, transfer, spending limit, and contribution limits. PCAs are fully regulated like parties, constituency associations that will require registration, audited annual spending and contribution limits. And the definition for PCAs have now been added throughout some of the other acts. All finance, surplus, transfer, and reporting sections are duplicated as well to cover PCAs. It revises the definition of contribution and introduces a statutory election expense definition that applies uniformly to parties, candidates, constituency associations, and PCAs. So now election expenses explicitly covers non-monetary contributions and reuse of materials in later campaigns. It includes expenses incurred in relation to the production of advertising or promotional materials, the distribution, broadcast, or publication of advertising or promotional material by any means during the election period, the payment of remuneration and expenses, securing a meeting space, and the conduct of election surveys or other surveys researched during an election. It introduces a requirement for every registered provincial party to incorporate as a not-for-profit by January 1st, 2026. This is extendable to July 1st, 2026, or lose registration status. And then it introduces numerous third-party advertisers of TPA changes. To this point, it adds a requirement that a TPA who engages or will engage in referendum advertising to disclose if they are for or against each question to be put to the electors. It adds a new TPA declaration that they are not acting directly or indirectly on behalf of a registered party. It adds new criterion that a third party is affiliated with a registered party, political party, if one person holds a position on the governing body of a third party and the governing body of a registered party. And then expense limit changes have also been made, but we're going to discuss that in a couple slides. Other changes allows people to purchase memberships for family members without needing a contribution receipt for amounts under $50. Adds an entire new section for the sales of merchandise under fundraising functions, allowing registered parties to sell merchandise at fair market value without issuing a contribution receipt except for the amounts that exceed that fair market value. Prohibits the investigation of complaints where the election commissioner does not have reasonable grounds to believe the matter constitutes an offense. And then some timeline changes to notice the document retention extended from 3 months to 6 months. Inspection of document timeline extended from 30 days to 3 months. And then letters of reprimand and bin penalty must be issued within 1 year instead of 3. So similar to what we saw in the previous act. Limit changes. Currently, party election expense limits are calculated via a formula. I didn't include the formula, didn't think it mattered that much. The new limit is a flat fee of $5 million. By-election party expenses now have increased from $28,000 to $75,000. Registered candidate expense limits have increased from $60,800 to $75,000. TPA election advertising spending limits have increased from $182,000 to $500,000. The TPA limit for promoting or opposing the election of a candidate has increased from $3,700 to $10,000. Contribution limits to TPAs have decreased from $34,400 to $5,000. And then contribution limits to registered leadership contestants. Currently, this is included in the aggregate total for contributions to parties, constituency associations, candidates, nomination contestants, and leadership candidates. This bill proposes a new separate maximum aggregate limit, annual contribution limit of $5,000.
Nothing to add other than to note the decrease in the contribution limits to third-party advertisers. That's quite a bit of a change. Everything else is not is also quite a bit of a change, but this one's an interesting one.
The LAEA. This had changes to campaign disclosures, so we've got 3 separate deadlines now. Annual, March 1st, mid-election year, September 30th, covering January 1st to July 31st, and then by-election, which is within 120 days of the by-election. Requires additional disclosure details, including an itemized expense schedule, a candidate self-funding line, and explicit surplus deficit totals. Candidates are provided a 30-day window from the date of becoming aware of a mistake to submit a correction statement. If contributions or expenses reach $50,000, a CPA review engagement must accompany the filing. TPA returns amends the timelines to be parallel with campaign disclosure timelines. Each disclosure must include a full financial statement, donor list for contributions more than $250, an expense limit report, placement details, and supporting documents. If no expenses were incurred, the return must say so. And then for all returns, municipalities must post redacted PDFs online, hiding street addresses and extraneous contact information. And in the case where corrections have been made, municipalities will also have to update and post the correction statements as well. Recall Act. This one has a couple slides, so bear with me. Shortens the application statement of reason from 200 words to 100 words. Establishes the mechanism through which the member named in an approved application may submit a statement of response, not to exceed 100 words. That sets out why, in their opinion, the recall is not warranted. Must be received within 7 days after the date of notice. And if it's received within that 7 days notice and does not exceed the 100-word limit, it must be included with the recall petition. It establishes that recall petitions can only begin 12 months after an MLA is elected and may not be issued 12 months before a set date general election. Requires that the CEO determine within 7 days if the requirements for issuing a recall petition have been met, and then extends the signature collection window from 60 days to 90 days. The signature threshold here has changed as well. So it's now to 60% of total number of electors who voted in the most recent election. If I recall correctly, and Wayne, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 40% of total registered electors in the previous or the current bill, current act. It reduces the verification period from 30 days to 21 days, allows union and corporate contributions, introduces a requirement to report results within 7 days of verification, and then reduces the time for a recall vote to be issued from 6 months to 4 months from the date the results of a successful petition are published. So it just means that they have to call an election within 4 months of the date instead of 6.
Yeah, that's part of the also keeping the acts consistent is this removing the focus on total number of electors. That seemed to be the old emphasis. Now it's on the actual voters who voted in the previous election. Now seems to be the benchmark for all of these acts across.
Moin, there's a question about whether or not the Recall Act applies to school board trustees. Do you know if that's the case?
Yeah, I was thinking that myself earlier, and maybe I'll keep looking while you talk, and I'll come back to it at the end. Yeah.
Thanks. We'll get back to you, Lorraine. Referendum Act. We're nearing the end here, folks. It allows the GOA to determine how and when the EFCDA would apply to a referendum through regulation. This change would also be applied to the Alberta Pension Protection Act. Removes the requirement for a referendum to occur before the Legislative Assembly makes a resolution authorizing an amendment to the Constitution of Canada, which would also apply to the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act. Provides a provision for the use of mail-in ballots in a constitutional referendum. Rewrites the act to rely on the EFCDA for finance rules and expressly forbids regulations from diluting third-party registration and disclosure rules. And it lets the CEO or cabinet discontinue and restart a referendum if an emergency disrupts voting, mirroring the same Senate election provision. the most inane part of the whole act is just, or the bill, sorry, cross-reference housekeeping act changes, and we've kind of, that should say bill changes, sorry. That we've kind of alluded to already throughout this presentation, but Bill 54 amendments that simply renumber or synchronize language used across all pieces of legislation impacted by this bill for those 4 acts there, so, those are very inane, inconsequential amendments that have been made for those 4 pieces of the legislation. And that's in a giant nutshell, Bill 54. Obviously, there's a lot in that one, but we're happy to take questions.
There's a there was a question in the I'll just looking in the chat, and there was a question. Cynthia says, "How is it proven if someone voted or not in previous elections? Is it a verbal self-identifying, or is signatures gathered on petitions compared to lists that are kept at polling stations?" So maybe I saw that question earlier, and I just wanted, maybe Cynthia, you can just explain. I wasn't clear. Are you asking about the number threshold? Is that what you're asking about? Because if that is the case, then they're just saying this many million people voted in total, and then all you need is so many percent. Oh, go ahead, Cynthia. I see you're raising your hand. Why don't you just jump in? You're muted, Cynthia. Maybe you can, or if you want to type.
Hi, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was trying to unmute myself.
Ah,
So like when people vote in advance polls, polling stations get a list and it shows that these people have voted. Then so they can't vote on election day again. And that same practice is not as diligently kept on election day. Like everybody who comes in is scratched off the list, but then it's not compiled anywhere else that person like Marcel Dupont at 14 3rd Street specifically voted. So if like so the returning office would keep those as part of all the election material, but then it's just not recorded anywhere else specifically. Then so if Marcel goes and says, I voted, and how do you prove that they actually did vote? Because that's not kept track of in a very accessible way in returning offices.
Oh, so you're asking about the election process in general.
Right.
That's a good question. That I think that's I'm off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that, because that's an Election Act general question. I don't think there's anything in these amendments that addresses that specific issue right now. So that would be a question we'd have to look into, either asking Elections Alberta, just direct that question to Election Alberta, or we could check.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
There was a question about, do you have to prove petitions signatory electors actually voted? I don't see that provision. I think honestly, it's just a numbers game at this point, and so regardless of the signatories voted or not, they're still included in the numbers.
Yeah, I think the goal of this act, the spirit of these amendments are to, or this bill, the spirit of these bill not, is to make the acts more permissive. So instead of what some argued were high thresholds for getting a question put on the ballot, now the threshold has been lowered, and the 2/3 requirement for constitutional questions has been eliminated. So we're moving in the era of more permissive putting of ballots or initiatives on the ballot.
Looking up. 3 hours, can start counting advance votes 3 hours before the close of polls. Does this apply to municipal general elections? Again. Best guess, it's not explicitly clear. Wayne, do you have a different?
I think because this is in the Elections Act, not the Local Elections Act, I suspect it's only for provincial. But again, at this stage, we're still. That's a good question. Let's mark that and double check. Local Elections Act. And
How's your hunt about whether recall applies to school trustees?
yeah, I'm gonna park that one. I have a sense based on it, but let's park that one and we'll send out a written response on that.
Okay.
Yeah, we're happy to take questions and then maybe we'll defer. As Eileen said, I mean, this is a 250-page bill, so trying to keep track of all the moving parts has been a bit of a challenge. But we're happy to take questions and then maybe we'll answer in written form later.
How does the bill define the scope of the referendum topics? It doesn't. Referendum topics in part will come from the Citizen Initiative Act. Go ahead, Wayne.
Oh, no, I was exactly that. Or the legislature could put the referendum, right? So the Referendum Act and the Citizen Initiative Act are two. So if the legislature wants to put a question to the voters, they can do that. The example of that would be the Alberta Pension Plan. If they had wanted to opt out of CPP, they could have. The legislature would put that question. But if citizens want to put a question themselves, what they do is they collect enough signatures and the question is valid. And the chief electoral officer determines that the question is valid. Either it's a policy change, a legislative change, or a constitutional change. The constitutional change is within Alberta's jurisdiction. The legislation are also within the Alberta legislation jurisdiction. Then the CEO will send it to the legislature, and then the legislature is obligated to put that question to a referendum.
Any other questions? Sorry, I know there's a lot in here.
We need not confuse the Elections Act with the absolutely. That's why we're being a bit cautious in answering questions that apply to the general elections and municipal elections and any other school board elections. Question I asked earlier about the election signs. Sorry, Shannon, I'm just trying to look for your earlier question, or maybe you can just retype what that question was.
Plan consultation.
Oh,
I don't suspect that there will be consultation. It's already proposed. It's in the it's in the bill, and that's the direction they're going. And so any consultation that was going to happen in theory would have happened before they proposed this change.
who oversees the validity of petitions and the administration of citizen? That will be the chief electoral officer.
Yeah. The chief electoral officer will be a ministry government appointed person. Know the rules that will be
in
talking.
theory, yes, but the legislature is ending. This is the question: will this bill have time for review, study by a legislative committee? It depends if they pass it by the end of this session, which is ending soon. Then probably not much. If they're going to defer this to the fall, then maybe. But I have a sneaking suspicion this will be passed in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, our session ends on the 15th, so we suspect that this will be passed in law by the 15th. The rules for signs, if and when this is passed, no, May 15th, if and when this is passed next week, the rules are in force when this passes. And so this will apply for your, in theory, this municipal election.
Just trying to look if I've missed.
So I'm just scrolling through the chat as well.
Yeah. Here's a question from Lynn. Regarding local elections, will all electors need to complete Form 13 as per Section 39? Changes, where does Form 13 apply? I assume by Form 13 you mean a statutory declaration form. Maybe I'll park that question too, just to
Yeah.
double check, because that's a very technical question. Form
What we'll do is we'll take all of the questions that have been put in the chat and we'll put together a document with written responses and we'll share that with the list of registrants as well. So everybody will have a written copy and we'll send that out with the PowerPoint slides too.
It's not a statutory. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a municipal electors Form 13. Sorry, this is my legal hat coming on here. Municipal, yes, municipal electors Form 13. Okay, let me look into that.
Danielle, your question. Yes, it was just a consolidation. I remember looking at that too.
Does elections Alberta? Cynthia's question. Does Elections Canada have paramountcy? Well, paramountcy is when there's a conflict between federal law and provincial law, but because Elections Canada deals with the federal elections and Elections Alberta deals with Alberta elections, so there's not really a conflict. So, I mean, the paramountcy question will come up in the following: if there's a rule that applies in Alberta that contradicts something that applies in the federal elections, then Alberta rules would not apply in the federal election, but vice versa, because Canada election acts apply to federal elections, and so our acts apply to provincial acts. So there wouldn't really be any contradiction or conflict between the two agencies.
Anybody have anything else that they'd like us to try to address? And if not address here, we could address offline.
So I have three questions that have been that we will address so far: the municipal, whether some of the recall provisions about the right of reply and so on and so forth apply to municipal and school board recalls. The Form 13 question about Section 39, so we'll look into that. And I think there was another question. Where am I? Just want to make sure I get everybody's questions here before we. I see quite a few questions that have now come in, so we'll go through these questions that are in the chat also and try to address those. But those were the two that I had written down. But I see more in the chat. So,
What are your top 3 or 4 remarkable changes?
for me, it's the lowering of the threshold for the constitutional initiative. That's the big one, because that's a big game changer. It's much easier to get to 180,000 or 175 or whatever the number is signatures than 600, and that you have to also make sure that it's in 2/3 of electoral districts. So I think that's a big change.
I would also say all the financial campaign changes are pretty significant. It's going to change elections for sure. I am curious to see how the repealing of the no advertising at political advertising at voting places goes, and what that impact is. I mean, there's more than 50 changes made throughout this bill. Each one of them, not each one of them, correction. A good chunk of them are pretty significant changes, I would argue. We're completely overhauling the way we do elections. And so I would say one of the other significant changes is the changes to voter eligibility or registration. So that is I guess some of those things. Anything else? If not, I really appreciate everybody joining. If you have more questions, our contact information is on the screen, and we will send out a follow-up document, and these recording will be available online. But otherwise, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you another time.